Құрметті әріптестер, бастайық. Уважаемые коллеги, давайте начнем. Я сделаю небольшое введение на русском языке, потом перейду на английский. Для тех, кто не понимает по-английски, предлагаю перейти на перевод, который будет доступен для всех участников. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to start this very interesting platform which we suggested to be held within the auspices of this Astana Economic Forum 2019. For me, it's an honor to be moderating a session, and I'm sitting between very interesting two speakers whom I will introduce just in a second. My name is Yerlik Karazhan. I'm the chairman of the board of Economic Research Institute of Kazakhstan. We work with the Ministry of National Economy based here in the city of Nur-Sultan. It's a very old institution, started in 1961. We deal with a number of issues with macroeconomic policy, with international relations, international economics, and a number of other issues which we do, and we consult the government and other interesting international organizations of working in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia. Today, within the auspices of Astana Economic Forum, we are hosting a number of extremely interesting guests, of whom I have Mr. Erik Reinert to my right, who is representing Norway, but I think is a global mind with good views on economic policy. His counterpart is Mr. Kenneth Rogoff, a very well-known speaker from the United States, who is also a very interesting representative of the neoliberal economic school. And I will elaborate a little bit more on that in a while. So today's subject is called Global Debates, New Economic Policy for Developing Countries. The issue is rather strong for the country, for Central Asia region. Developing countries, despite an impressive growth in the early 2000s, have not yet recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. The rise of populism, which has led to growing protectionism and nationalism in developing countries, has led to a negative impact on development prospects of the global south. The developing countries need to adopt new economic policies to achieve an inclusive economic growth. These are the statements which we like, especially given that within Economic Research Institute we're really covering the philosophy of inclusive economic growth and working on that very strictly. The best minds of the planet in the area of development and implementation of economic policy will face, in the framework of this debate session, each other, but not really more to say is not each other, but more your mindsets and your philosophical thinking. One of the debaters is Kenneth Rogoff, whom I presented before. He used to be chief economist of the International Monetary Fund in 2001 and 2003. Contributed to the emergence of global financial stability debate and developed recommendations on economic policies for countries on the verge of crisis. Mr. Erik Reinert, one of the main creators of the new Other Canon Foundation. Dr. Reinert calls for abolishing the division of economists into left and right. He criticizes the neoclassic economic school and provides new explanations for the gap between the rich and poor countries. So, dear colleagues, we'll have about 30 minutes today to discuss the issues of economic policies, and I will be looking at a number of issues generally. So what I wanted to do is I want to first ask and give the floor to Mr. Erik Reinert. We know that the approach that is taken by Mr. Reinert is very broad. You've done a significant work on the evolution of economic theory and what's happening today. You're one of the criticizers of the neoliberal approach. Can you explain that, please?
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation. My interest in economics was born in Peru when I was a relatively young person, and I noticed that the people who did the same work in Norway and in Peru had very different pace. So my question was, it's more difficult to drive a bus in Peru than in Norway. Why should the Norwegian bus driver have an income that was 20 times that of his Peruvian counterpart? And I thought I could look that up in a dictionary when I came home, but I couldn't. And after about 40 years, 20 of them running a business, I wrote a book called How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor. And the answer, the relatively simple answer to the question of the wage of the bus driver is, with whom does he share his labor market? Right? And then I went back as far as I could to find reasonable economic theory. And I found that economic theory was born out around the 1590s, 1600. It was born from a curious question. A lot of gold and silver was flowing in from Mexico, from Peru, from Bolivia to Spain. What happened was that Spain got deindustrialized, and all the money ended up in big cities like Venice, Amsterdam, Florence. So the question is, well, why does the gold end up in countries where there are no mines? So these early economists, Giovanni Botero, Antonio Serra, they said, well, there is something different about the cities. And the activities of the cities, they are subject to increasing returns, which means that the more they produce, the lower the costs. And there are also a lot of different activities. Today would say synergies. But they said, well, if you want to know the wealth of a city, go into the city and count the number of professions, which is an interesting point of view. So you have increasing returns, and you have diversity, and they said, here are also the potentials for innovation. And they said, in the countryside, you don't have that. You have diminishing returns. The land the best land is normally taken first, and as you increase your production, your productivity would tend to fall. And this has been discovered over and over again. Interesting, one person who rediscovered this was Alfred Marshall, the founder of neoclassical economics, who wrote this very clearly in his book from 1890. But when economics chose equilibrium as their metaphor, the difference between increasing and diminishing return had to be thrown out. So economics go by fashion. Sometimes when things go well in the theory-producing country, economics gets very, very abstract. And then when the hegemon, the leading power, loses power, well, then they start protecting. So what's happening now in the United States is just the same thing that happened to England when they stopped being the world hegemon. They started protecting their industry again. So there's some things here which are, what looks like confusion is, in a sense, can be expected. What we find, the confusion we find today is at the end of the cycle of free trade. There was a similar cycle which ended in 1848. There was one cycle which ended in the mid-30s. So this is expected. And the interesting thing about these cycles is that the abstract theory collapses because it's attacked from both the right and the left at the same time. We saw in 2016 that free trade was attacked from Sanders in the United States from the left and from the right. In 1848, it was in the same year Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto attacked it, and the great liberal John Stuart Mill attacked it. So this is normal. And I wanted to show you one slide, but there are no slides. But allow me to do like in a kindergarten, show and tell. This is a picture of two stamps, right? And to your left is a stamp from West Germany, and it portrays an economist called Friedrich List. And to your right, there is a stamp from the German Democratic Republic, from the communist Germany, and it also reproduces exactly the same portrait of Mr. List. So you can tell me how many heroes did East and West Germany have in common? Only one, this guy. And the list was the man who inspired Sergei Witte, who was the Minister of Finance during the last two Tsars, the man who built the Trans-Siberian Railway, and also translated Friedrich List. So when the people were asking in 1930, what are the Bolsheviks really doing? Well, they're following, just like Western Europe, the theories of Friedrich List. So this is something we have forgotten. We thought that communism and Western capitalism were extremely different. Yes, they were extremely different, but they had one important thing in common, the cult of manufacturing. And that cult of manufacturing built wealth in both countries. But unfortunately, when the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989, this was forgotten. Right? So if we go back to the rector of the University of Berlin in the late 1800s, he said there are two irrational twins out there. There is Manchester liberalism, which thinks that free trade will solve everything, and there is communism, which will solve everything just by turning society upside down. He said, these are the two irrational twins, and none of them will ever win. So we had a period, most of the 19th century, where between these irrational twins, between the communists and the free traders, there were many options. And one of the options, the title of a book which came in 1930 was Sweden, the Third Way. And I think, coming from Norway, I think this third way is actually the best way. You subsidize manufacturing for a while, and when your manufacturing is competitive, you go to free trade. So it's not a matter of protectionism and free trade, it's a matter of when to stop protecting. And there the United States wrote the book. You know, they were very protectionist up until the late 19th century, and then the businesses discovered that, well, in order to compete now on the world market, we need bigger markets, so we need free trade. So it's a problem of timing more than anything else. And I think this is what we have to rediscover, and there we also rediscover the role of the government. And we heard yesterday former chief economist of the World Bank, Paul Romer, I think setting the tone for the ideological shift towards the role of government. That government is coming back and it's playing the role let's say it used to play in Scandinavia. It doesn't have to be a big government, but it has to be a government making decisions.
Mr. Reinert, thank you very much. Very interesting overview. Mr. Rogoff, if I may address you, would you comment? Would you provide your neoliberal thoughts on this?
I first want to sort of reject the neoliberal. I've never had that label before, and I don't accept it. I certainly go to trades. I don't work in trade, by the way. I work on international macroeconomics, but I go every week to our international trade seminars, and people are studying policy issues of what the government should do, what is the optimal government intervention. Anyway, I want to say that Professor Reinert's written a terrific book. I learned a lot from it. They're very interesting philosophical views. I recommend to everyone to read it. I will take away many things from it. And actually, in what he said, I've little to disagree with, except maybe to the very end. I don't want to focus too much on U.S. history. There's been a lot of work on tariffs, but there's certainly been a lot of work on this idea that the U.S. grew because of tariffs. And my read of it is many economists have concluded they don't necessarily get it right. And by the way, I applaud the way Mr. Reinert writes, Professor Reinert writes about some economists like Paul Krugman are very smug, absolutely sure they're right, they're speaking the word of God. And of course, you have to have uncertainty. I'm expressing that. But certainly in the work I've seen on tariffs, and growth in the United States, the U.S. had huge population growth. The U.S. had 3 times the investment that the United Kingdom, that Great Britain did at the time. And actually, where a lot of the productivity growth seems to have occurred were in the non-traded sectors. And there's some evidence that the tariffs prevented capital goods imports and held back the traded sectors. And there's work. I have a brilliant young colleague, Nathan Nunn, who writes in development in Africa and other countries. He's looked at the role of tariffs, and he does find there's a correlation that countries that put tariffs on skilled imports, it's associated with growing faster in skilled imports. But he argues maybe a quarter of that is the direct effect, and 3/4 of it are the countries that are doing better in some of skilled industries have a more powerful lobby, and they're more likely to get tariffs. It's just difficult to show the causality. Let me just make a few more introductory points. I think that it's very true that increasing returns to scale in manufacturing has been important, but I think it's also very unclear where the future lies here, whether the path that, for example, East Asia followed, can other countries still follow that, or do we have to do something else? I think it's a real conundrum. Certainly, if we look at here in Kazakhstan, I think it's problematic to think too much in terms of throwing up trade barriers. It's a very isolated geographically country. It's very difficult to trade.
Before we go into Kazakhstan issue, and the story of Kazakhstan is very interesting, I agree. But I want to spend a bit more time on the discussion that we earlier had. Would you agree that the timing issue is a valid point? That is in terms of the role of the state and its interference?
No, I mean, the role, well, I mean, they're very broad questions. For example, the contrast between Scandinavian countries, which are very small, and how you would run a country that was much larger, that's less homogeneous. But the role of the state, of course it's important everywhere. You're setting antitrust rules. I have to say, Professor Reinert goes through these systematically. Everything I'm going to say, he answers in his book, and I invite you to read his book. But I'm going to say them nevertheless. I mean, you go through competitiveness, you go through the tax regime. Let's come back to tariffs. It wasn't easy to collect revenue any other way back at that time. You couldn't have collected an income tax if you tried. And certainly today, if you go to many African countries, the IMF tells them, don't use so many tariffs, use an income tax to get your revenue. And they say, that's really hard. We don't know what anyone's getting paid. We don't have any information on this. So there I think a lot of subtle questions. But I mean, clearly the state makes a role in what education is, what infrastructure gets built. So the role, and Paul Romer, pointed this out particularly with urban growth. You don't want a free-for-all, but. No, I think it is important to point at individual cases, and maybe I'll just lastly say, if I could substitute Lee Kuan Yew for Donald Trump, I would happily let him do whatever he wanted in the United States, and I think we would do very well. But there are many countries you can look around the world that weren't so fortunate as to have such a wise state. Latin America is a catastrophe, including Peru. They're doing maybe better now, but they've really been held back by having very authoritarian states that were too interfering in the economy.
Thank you. Thank you. So the story is still about the state and markets. As you said, I'm not that well brainwashed because I did my master's degree in international political economy at LSE, and that school is very famous for liberal approaches of Margaret Thatcher and the rest. But so the question is, again, to you, that is, okay, the story of infant industry protection the story that we've been discussing with you is a very interesting one. At the time, we were talking that there are good strategies for national policies in terms of how to develop your industry, and still there is a strong role for the government, and still that's the question, when do governments need to leave the industry?
Yeah, well, I think Professor Rogoff is touching on something very important, which is tax collection, and the dual effect of tariffs was protecting industry and giving national income. You know, about the only thing that the government could control were the ports, right? And that's where they collected the revenue. And if I'm not wrong, around 1870, tariffs was more than around 70–80% of U.S. government income. So you have this fantastic double effect for a poor country, which cannot, you know, the United States wasn't sophisticated enough to have income tax until about 1913, something like that. Yeah. And I think this is an important thing, this double effect of tariffs. You provide revenue and you build industry. That's very important. And you know, you would say that if it's an infant industry argument, like the great liberalist John Stuart Mill said, well, when the economy grows up, it will again, the state can draw back. But then you have the person who coined the term, I think, for modern windows of opportunity, is Carlota Perez, who studies technology and says there are new techno-economic paradigms. And you know, whenever the basic technology shifts, you can argue that there is a new infant industry argument for the government. So whenever there are big technological shifts, the government has to shift education, and it has to shift its demand, it has to upgrade. So you know, that is, I think, also cyclical. We disagree, I think, on the role of tariffs in Latin America. East Asia put on tariffs. You know, they protected high-tech products for the world market for a very brief time. That was very efficient. Latin America protected forever old-fashioned products for the local market. But also that protectionism made Latin America relatively successful. If you go back to the ideas of Friedrich List said you have to do this gradually. There are too many states in Germany. When he wrote there were 30. First we have to unify Germany, then we have to unify Europe, and then when everybody is at the same level, we can have world free trade. And Latin America went from protecting, overprotecting a very small market into the global trade, and didn't have this intermediary thing. Latin American Free Trade Association was there on paper, but it never worked. Oh. So they went. So that was like the shock therapy. So Latin America had a shock therapy similar to that that the Soviet Union had, and my wife and I were living in Peru in the late 70s, and we saw how industry died out, and we saw the children who were begging for sweets. One year, when industry died, the same children were begging for canned milk. Right? So you could actually see it. So what is very important, I think, is to understand that it's better for a country to have a relatively inefficient industry than not to have any industry at all. And that goes against the logic of trade theory. But it's like saying it's better to be a mediocre lawyer in this city than to be this city's best dishwasher. Right? You know, our parents don't say to their children, my daughter, my son, you obviously have a comparative advantage in washing dishes, so stick to that.
I would just say you would be very unlucky if you were the person being represented by the mediocre lawyer.
Yes, but I agree. But the point is that it's better to be a mediocre lawyer than to be the most efficient dishwasher. And if you extend that to the nation, And the Ukraine and Georgia are examples of this. These are countries that were actually wealthier under communism, under this incredibly inefficient system called communism. They were wealthier. They were wealthier with an industry than they are now with that industry dying. And that is not in our interest to let that industry die. It's not in the, you know, Latvia lost its industry. Latvia lost, and 20% of the population left, right? Well, that was 1 million people. It wasn't a big problem. But if the Ukraine gets deindustrialized, you know, 40 million, that's 8 million people leaving.
But let's go back to the lawyer example. There are a lot of countries that protected their computer industry in Latin America, and it was a disaster because you needed to have the computers in order to do hundreds of other things, and often the imported goods are intermediates into production. And again, I'll go back to, we could have Lee Kuan Yew deciding how, you know, how things are done. It's great. But in many countries, it's a very messy political system. People lobby for tariffs. You don't always get the right ones. There may be some that you should have, but you get many that you shouldn't.
So, well, I would say, unfortunately, Mr. Trump seems to be listening to the wrong lobbyist. But that is certainly a problem. And I'm not saying you should necessarily go after the high tech. You know. And if you integrate nations, the first thing that dies is the most advanced activity in the least advanced country. The first thing that died in Czechia and in Brazil was the computer industry, and it probably should die. But I'm not saying necessarily go after the peak, but go after what creates employment and what creates products. Maybe you should protect your marmalade industry. You know, when I'm in Mongolia, well, they have bottled water from Hong Kong. You know, maybe they should protect their bottled water industry. So it's not necessarily about high tech producing the high tech. It's probably more using the high tech. You know, we can't all be we can't all compete with Bangalore and the programmers there. So that's not the point. The point is to have a wide distribution of industrial products, what people consume. And Harvard University is divided by a river, the Charles River. And Professor Rogoff is a distinguished professor at one side of the river, and I was a student at Harvard Business School on the other side of the river.
Yes, so that's the commonality you have.
but after that, I had a PhD in economics. So I come from this less abstract theory, and one of the problems here is the level of abstraction, and another one is the specialization of universities. You know, Harvard University is probably the best university in the world, and it has a very interesting coat of arms.
And we're supposed to debate it when he says that.
No, but this is important, where we come from, because where you stand depends on where you sit, and I stand on a completely different theoretical background, and that's why we disagree. And my take of the metaphor of Harvard is that it's three books, veritas, V-E, which means truth. So it's V-E in the first book, R-I in the second, and T-I-S in the third, veritas. And the problem is that students are not required to read all books, right? So if the economists had been forced to read the history book, they would have seen the world very differently. So my joke on the Harvard coat of arms is actually very serious, right? If you, like Mark Twain said, if the only tool you know is a hammer, you spend the world looking for nails, right? And that's why we need economists with a lot of tools. We need economists like with your tools and with my tools. And I think when we are in this ideological confusion right now, I think my tools have better answers because they're adapted to different contexts.
Can we look now at the government spending part? That is like going back to the story of Kazakhstan, right? Looking at our budget here in the country, though we proclaim the idea of market economy, what we see is that almost 50% even more than that, of the budget spending is social in the country. So basically, my question is, when do you stop spending so much time? Because normally you would think that market should regulate that, right? You would need a market to regulate your social behaviors in the country.
I'm not sure I follow that. I mean, you have a country where the income's coming in very concentrated sectors of the economy, which do not by any means employ everyone. So it's, if you look at Norway or other countries that have natural resources, I think it's very common to have a significant amount of redistribution through social programs. What is an issue in Kazakhstan is not the way that money is spent, which I think is healthy, but an issue is that the oil sector is so large that it's been very hard to have a more diversified economy. It's very hard to reduce the role of the state and try to have more competitive industries, try to have more small businesses. And I think that's an area where many countries, there's nothing unique about it, but if you read the IMF and the World Bank reports and others, I think it's something Kazakhstan struggled with, even though it's been very well run. But it's reached a point where in order to increase productivity, you need to have more competition. I think the fact that Kazakhstan will have to come into the World Trade Organization in a year and a half is a godsend. It's a blessing. I think it'll force competition, opening. I could begin with the banking sector, which I think is problem number one here in Kazakhstan, where bringing in more competition would be healthy.
Thank you for the comment. Just, I really like more like a constructive approach to the future, if I may say, the assessments. What are the windows of opportunities that you see for the country like ourselves? You mentioned the oil industry. We appreciate that. We need to diversify. Where to diversify and how?
Well, I mean, I think the idea that they're trying in the Astana International Financial Center is very intriguing. This is a country that is double landlocked. It's really hard, expensive to trade. If you make manufacturers, it's going to be very, very hard to export them. But digital things, you can. And I don't know if that will work, but that's a clever thing to try. Another issue, which is I think policymakers here are very keenly attuned to, is how to have more value added within the commodity exploration center, because sector. There's services, equipment, engineering expertise. There's so many areas where there can be value added. And this is a delicate balance of how do you encourage more local content versus maintain, having the sector grow in a healthy way. But that's clearly, I think the authorities are right to look at that area, because that's an area where Kazakhstan has a comparative advantage, I think. So things which are digital, where you don't face the trade costs that you do in other things, and certainly things that are very internal to the country are going to be very promising in the future.
Mr. Reinert, when I looked at your biography, there's a special note stating that you visited almost like 70 countries in the world during your life, stayed there, worked there.
70, yeah. Working in 70 countries, plus some tourist places.
So again, coming back to the same question which I raised earlier. So, okay, looking at that example, knowing your expertise, looking back to your previous book in economics, can you give some kind of views on what would be the windows of opportunities for Kazakhstan?
Well, let me first take the social spending. I think the answer to that is never. No. And if we ask ourselves, why is it that the world's most efficient farmers, be they in the United States or in the European Union, why do they need so many subsidies? And why do they need price support? well, then we also explain automatically why no country can grow rich on agriculture. So there is an implicit income distribution from increasing returns activities to diminishing returns activities to agriculture in every country. And I think that will have to be that forever. And I think the fact that you use 50% is good. And let me also say that one important lesson from trade is that what the UN institutions called symmetrical trade in the 60s and 70s is always beneficial to both parties. So the idea that you go into a free trade area with Russia, with Armenia, and with Belarus is a good idea, because then you don't have this winner-killing effect that you get when you trade with more advanced countries. So I say, symmetrical trade is always a good idea, but avoid the asymmetrical ones. So on the windows of opportunity, I think your strategy, Kazakhstan's strategy of diversifying out of the raw material sectors was much more unfashionable 15 years ago than it is now. So in a sense, my country, Norway, industrialized after free trade. The idea of free trade had collapsed in 1848. That's when we could start industrializing. And I think this is a similar window of opportunity, that actually what you're doing is going to be more recognized, and it's going to be more respected. It's not an easy task, but if you look at the idea back from Giovanni Botero, it's adding value. Well, how can we add value to Wolfram? I don't know. I don't know enough about the Wolfram business. Can you, if it goes into the light bulbs, should you do light bulbs? I don't know. But this is the idea. And also, as Professor Rogoff says, the engineering aspects of this. So it's deeper and deeper technological knowledge of what you're working with, and getting closer to the final product. If you produce wheat, don't sell wheat for 400 euro a ton from the Ukraine to Italy and buy spaghetti back for 4,000. Make the spaghetti yourself. So this is a generalized recipe for adding more value. And there are examples also from Russia. Those of you who are old enough to have been through the 90s, everyone was eating what was called bush legs, which was U.S. chickens. And one of the few success stories in Russia is that with a very small intervention in tariff and sanitary regulation, Russia managed to build a poultry industry. Right? So it's much more difficult to get back family farming, and beef and milk, but poultry was relatively easy. So you can look at all these examples and see what other countries have done before you. And as I say, free trade is more a matter of timing. The key thing is timing, when to stop. And you're clearly not at the level where you can stop, and you have advanced so fast that there's some regions that probably still don't have running water and sanitary installations. You have to let these regions catch up. And I think also in terms of welfare. So I think, therefore, I kind of admire the 50%.
I just want to pick up on the point about when to stop. I think that's actually a very difficult question. So a lot of things, some things work, a lot of things don't work, but they develop entrenched interests. People don't want to give up the subsidies. And I think if you look at farming in the U.S., there are all these places. Doesn't have the significance it did. We're not protecting jobs. We're just protecting people with very rich farms. We're protecting states that have 2 senators and disproportionate voting share. It's worse in Japan. So you get in place something which might have been a good idea, and then it's not. You emphasize the point of when to stop it, but it takes a lot of wisdom, and your political system has to be one that can accommodate stopping at the right time.
Yeah. Yes, it's the story of political will, in a sense, as you say, right?
And wisdom.
And wisdom, that's right. You commented on the analytical review, Mr. Reinert and Mr. Rogoff, which is about Kazakhstan and the global world. And I see that one of the comments, this quotation that you give, is that Kazakhstan needs to follow an open economy and invest into infrastructure, education, and development. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, I was in a session earlier on in the fourth industrial revolution and what sort of became what are the policy prescriptions. And I think, to me, a short answer to that is that the same for the first one, the second one, and the third one, that you want to have a dynamic private sector. You need good governance. You need a good government structure also. And some of the things government needs to provide are education, and I would say in the case of Kazakhstan, giving thought to where you want to concentrate your resources. For example, there is a very big oil and gas sector here. I can tell you people coming from US universities aren't thinking about that. They want to go work at Facebook and Google or Goldman Sachs. And you can go the same in France or many countries. And here people can see what those jobs are, what's interesting. So there's role in education. Of course, I think the Silk Road project, it's got risk, but it's be great for Kazakhstan because precisely you're very isolated physically, and an infrastructure project like that can generate a lot going forward. And I already mentioned areas where I think Kazakhstan has potential. I think agriculture is a big area for potential once you can export it. It'll potentially be, you already export wheat, I understand, but there are potentials for exporting meat to China, for example, that could be quite important in the future.
Again, comparative advantages as well, yeah, I agree. Do you want to comment on that? Because I think you didn't answer the question of opportunities for Kazakhstan, but you looked at the report. Can you comment?
Well, I looked at the report, and I think it opens up a wide perspective. But I think if you look at Venezuela, who received an enormous amount of money from their oil sector, I think the most important thing you have to do is to avoid the resource curse, which Venezuela has. This is the key thing. And therefore you have to diversify into old technologies, new technologies, you know. The food sector is important. This is a very cold country, you know, and it reminds me of the Andes where it's summer every day and winter every night. Maybe you can adopt some of the cereals that tolerates night frost almost all year round. You know, there are a lot of opportunities, and I think you spelled it out very well. But I think the bottom line is avoid the resource curse, which really is awful. We see now with Venezuela how serious it is, and that means diversifying in all directions. And in my view, it means, for example, look at your import sector and have the Russian chicken problem in the back of your mind and say, where is it that with a minimum of intervention, like the Russians did with the chicken, we can actually create more jobs here? And you know, early industries are never competitive. That's why they need protection. You know, very few companies make any money for the first 5 years. And that's also an argument for some kind of protection. So I would say, look at your import bill and see where you are, with a relatively small intervention, you can add more value. And this is actually what Russia did, and that's one of the few success stories from Russia.
I was just going to say, it's the first time I've ever been described as a neoliberal, but it's also the first time I've ever heard Russia used as an example that other countries should follow. But you did give an example.
Saying in all the disasters, They lost 50% because of free trade. Let's face it, because of free trade shock, they lost 50% of their industry, they lost 50% of their agriculture, and they lost 50% of the real wages. And that was because of experts from Harvard and other places. So I think there is a reason why the people in the West should be so arrogant, because we in the West were a main reason for that disaster. So I think we should think of the fantastic damage we did with free trade. Average male age went down by 7 years. It was a disaster. And I think we as academics in the West have part of that blame.
You're going to say that all the chaos around, or the majority of the chaos around the fall of the Soviet Union had to do with the free trade that followed? I mean, I think we can agree there were a lot of other sources in the transition, the disruption, the violence, the corruption. I was in Moscow in the 90s, and it was pretty crazy. I mean, the government collapsed in a way. The rule of law collapsed. So, I mean, the free trade was the least of their problems.
Extremely interesting discussion, if I may. Coming back to a comparison and talking about Harvard, that you're on the two sides of the river, I feel like I'm in the river now. You don't have to agree or disagree with each other. We understand there are two various ways on how to interpret things, and this is the good thing about academia. I would like to thank you for your comments. I'm sure there will be more questions and more thinking to be done and research to be done. And before we close up this session, what I wanted to do is ask you for final comments. Two things. One is if there were issues or questions or topics that you wanted to cover, but you couldn't at AEF for a number of reasons, at Astana Economic Forum, can you raise them now? And also second question, that is, we're looking at the opportunities again to boost the economic development, not only in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality, where we need quality of growth. That is, so what would be your takeaway from Astana Economic Forum and the recommendations for that? Do you want to?
And you asked what I didn't manage to cover?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Well, the core of the world economic order at the moment is the idea of David Ricardo of comparative advantage. That's one I try to have the problem with washing dishes or being a mediocre lawyer. N-grams is a fantastic new discovery. I can actually go into books and look at the frequency of different words. I did a check on comparative advantage since it was discovered by David Ricardo in 1817. And this is the axis from 1817 till 2008. And you see, comparative advantage really came on the map with Paul Samuelson in the late 1940s. So we think that because this theory is from 1817, it's been accepted since 1817. That's not true. I mean, if we start working with n-grams, we will find how different economic theory developed during the Cold War. The communists had the idea of from each according to ability and from each according to need. Well, the counter utopia was Paul Samuelson's factor price equalization, that if we all had free trade, that wages will tend to be equal and the price of capital will tend to be equal around the world. What happened in many cases was factor price polarization. So I think the message I would like to get across is that there are 500 years of economic theory which is very different from the last 70. And we should study more. And the interesting thing is that at US universities, the strategy of the United States is in the 1800s is very little covered. So my message is, we have to go back to the old truths. And in terms of this forum, it has been extremely interesting, and I've learned a lot about a country I knew very little about. It's a bit like my own country. It's cold, sparsely populated, and has oil. But apart from that, it's very different. And I must say, I think I had a gave a talk at the university here at the other side of the, beyond the shopping center here this morning. And I thought it was very interesting. Impressive building, impressive areas, 3,000 students, and all the teaching is in English. So I thought, wow, these are people who are getting they're getting into globalization, but at their right pace.
I certainly agree. It's remarkable, the education system here and Kazakhstan's attempt to, its great efforts and the strides it's made in being such a globally important country, which I would never have guessed 25 years ago that this would have evolved so quickly. I do think that an element of successful development, it's boring to say, but is macroeconomic stability. Have a stable, relatively stable prices, relatively balanced, not balanced, but not getting into trouble with your budget deficits, which is different for different countries, and trying to maintain a viable lending sector. And these are all constant struggles, and I think things which remain very important in being successful as a country.
Thank you very much. To conclude, and I wanted to thank you, colleagues, and Mr. Rogoff, Professor Reinert. This is an extremely interesting debate, which can go on and on, I think, for many interesting topics. Astana Economic Forum is being held for the 12th time, and I think it will continue. What we're trying to do is we're building a kind of a society, a club around Nur-Sultan, around Kazakhstan. We call it the Friends of Astana Economic Forum. So if I may say, welcome to the club. We'll be asking for more questions, and thank you for coming, and welcome back. Thank you very much.